sea whispered of a thing older than memory, a slow, cold breath beneath the world that had learned patience in the deep and hunger in the dark, and the island that had kept its own strange lore for millennia, answered with a roar that shook birds from trees and set chapels of cliff to trembling. For generations, the people had told the story of a single sovereign who wore the island like a crown and bled with it. Vast fists that could bend trees, a face that held the echo of loneliness, an intelligence that had learned to read both threat and sorrow. They called him many names, but the world would not know him properly until the sea showed its teeth. When tectonic fingers pried open a rift in the abyss, the water did not simply ripple. It recoiled as if even the ocean feared the thing it had birthed. Leviathan rose like a continent, coming awake, scales like folded midnight, a mouth that swallowed ships and tides, eyes that burned with currents older than kings. Cities learned the meaning of smallness. Islands learned how fragile their place was. The first philosophers who tried to name the clash reached for metaphors and found them thin. This was not merely muscle against muscle. It was a confrontation between two orders of existence. The island's custodial life, the brute, thinking will that had evolved to protect, and the sea's ancient entropy, an intelligence that was less thought than pattern, less motive than law. In the markets and in the caves, between fishermen who read gull wings and elders who read bone, men and women argued not about which would die, but about what the fight meant. Some said the ocean had always been right to reclaim, that Leviathan was the metronome of natural balance, the deep's verdict on islands that dared to stand. Others said Kong was not simply a beast, but the island's conscience, a living corrective against the slow decay of civilizations that forgot to honor what sustained them. The debate hardened into philosophy. Was power merely the capacity to destroy, or did true power require the capacity to remember? Was primeval scale the same as rightful dominion? Two scholars old as coral and sharp as obsidian debated in a moonlit amphitheater while the sea hummed its low note. The first argued for Leviathan, the logic that totality beat partiality, that the ocean's claim to vastness made it the arbiter of survival. Scale, he said, is not merely size, it is jurisdiction. To dwell in eternity grants the right to reorder lesser things. The second scholar countered with a story, not of law but of intimacy. A boy who had watched a great ape take a falling child from the path of a snapping log and cradle him until the storm passed. Power without care is tyranny, she said. To hold the island is to answer for every living thing upon it. That answering is not weakness, it is the source of mastery. Neither argument could be disentangled from evidence. Leviathan had splintered fleets and buckled the spine of the sea. It had unmade ports and tuned ocean floors into instruments of annihilation with a single subsonic cry. Kong had felled rival titans, had learned to use remnants of human industry, axes, rigging, metal, and had turned grief into cunning, pain into improvisation. The real hinge between their philosophies, whispered in the humid nights under stars, was this. Leviathan represented inevitability, an indifferent law that reduced everything into its tide. Kong represented contingency, an agency honed by relationship, by the necessity to protect, to choose, to invent. The philosophers named it differently, order and will, abyss and guardian. But the island itself did not care for labels. Villages built inwards, old offerings were set at cliff edges, fires were tended with a care that felt like prayer. Kong watched the sea the way a king watches a distant thunderhead, a slow calculation in his eyes, and the island answered with tremor and scent. The tectonic crack watched as well, and from some depth the Leviathan's breath smelled of cold pressure and collapsed stars. When fishermen who had seen the first shadows returned with nets empty and faces pale, the island's defenders understood that argument alone would not save, strategy would. So the island's story bent toward action, ways to turn the sea's own rules against itself, caches of salvaged metal, careful mapping of vents and shoals where deep pressure met volcanic throat, places where Leviathan could be led, where weight and leverage might matter more than scale. The philosophers said the outcome would prove the thesis that most held true. If inevitability prevailed, the sea would swallow the island and its stories. If will prevailed, the island would persist and the world would have to reckon with a beast that wielded responsibility like a sword. But the island's elders, who had watched both compassion and hunger in Kong, knew a subtler truth. The battle would be less about the immediate winner than about what each creature forced the world to remember about itself. That night, under a sky threaded with electric green like veins on a beast, Kong climbed the highest basalt spine and roared a sound that belonged to mountain and memory both. The ocean answered with a voice that shook marrow. Something ancient shifted. Men and women who would never forget took that moment as both omen and charge. They had turned philosophy into plan and prayer into preparation. They had chosen the place where Leviathan might be drawn nearer to land, where water's advantage could be blunted by the island's cunning. The debate would be settled in violence, yes, but also in what violence revealed about the kind of world that would remain afterward. Would it be a world that yielded to the inexorable cold of the deep, or one that answered the deep with a living, imperfect, fiercely chosen fidelity? Kong listened, and for the first time since his island became myth, he understood that his fight was also an ethical wager. He could not win merely by being larger, for he would have to turn his history of care into tactics, convert every grief and lesson into a strategy that could nick an ancient armor and make it bleed. The philosopher's final words before the dawn argued that survival was not a neutral good. It was a proof of meaning. If Kong won, they said, it would mean that intentional guardianship mattered more than sheer primordial right. If Leviathan won, it would mean that the world's oldest laws remained untroubled. The waves that morning carried both verdicts toward the island, and the wind carried Kong's answer. A thunder that was not just fury, but a decision. The island held its breath for the day the sea would decide to come ashore. When the water first withdrew, it did so like a beast drawing back to swallow its prey, and a hollowing sound moved through the coves that smelled of vacuum. Ships listing, reefs exposed, and the exposed bones of the ocean's floor glinting like bone. Leviathan rose again, as if answering some moonlit summons, coils of abyssal mass sliding over themselves, the world's pressure and salt concentrated into sinuous intent. It struck like a rumor, then a wall. Towers shuddered at the first slap of its tail. A harbor folded as water hurled inland and receded, dragging the sea's cold breath across stone in a long, predatory sigh. Kong met it at the shoreline where basalt jutted into the sea, a silhouette against a sky gone bruised, and his roar cut across the maelstrom not as a challenge but as an articulation of ownership. The fight began with tests. Tidal strikes that tried to unmake the cliff where Kong stood, a sonic pulse that vibrated the very hem of the island and forced birds to fall from the air. He took the first brunt by throwing his weight into the land, planting his fists in the earth and letting the island take blows it had learned to accept for centuries. Both beasts measured one another. Leviathan's scales were a geography of defiance, each plate layered like narrative, deep enough to shrug off missiles, thick enough to make most blades sing out. Its maw could create vortices that swallowed entire villages into collapsing whirlpools. Yet in the water it moved with a fluent malignancy. On land its coils turned ponderous, each movement a heavy tide that, while devastating, could not outmaneuver a creature built to scale cliffs and swing from broken rigging. Kong used that slowness like a hand uses a crack in a wall. He baited and he feinted. He struck the edges of Leviathan's exposed flesh when it breached, punching into softer tissue where scales diverged, gouging with the broken rungs of a ship's mast he had lifted like a club. He used the axe, an artifact of human industry he'd learned to wield, not because it was sharp enough to pierce the deepest hide, but because its geometry and the energy stored in it could be leveraged into concussive strikes that rattled internal organ. Leviathan retaliated by pulling the island toward the sea, wrapping itself around basalt like a constrictor, trying to rewrite geography, and Kong felt the island's bones groan under tidal pressure. He was pulled into the water, a place that should have been Leviathan's home advantage. There the fight narrowed into a terrifying calculus. Kong could not breathe as the Leviathan did. Leviathan could not use gravity and solid leverage as Kong did. So Kong created leverage where there was none. He dove into rips and vents, guiding Leviathan through channels carved by ancient lava flows, where sudden changes in pressure and explosive outgassing could be weaponized. In one such throat, Kong drove the axe into a seam between scales and ripped, tearing a furrow that bled salt and steam. Leviathan's response was to unleash a low-frequency blast meant to shatter internal organs. The sound buckled Kong's ribs and set the shoreline stones dancing. Pain taught him a vocabulary of weakness. He learned the pattern of Leviathan's throat. How, when it inhaled to launch a tidal strike, its great eye rolled back to clear debris and leave a thin membrane exposed. Kong targeted that membrane with repeated strikes, not single heroic blows but attritional ones, pummeling, gouging, pressing all his weight through the breach until Leviathan's massive head rocked. The island's defenders watched and acted as part of his strategy. Ropes were tethered to capstans and dragged to anchor points. A jury-rigged network of conductive cables stretched between ruined pylons and a shattered ship's mast that had been set on a promontory like an offering to the violence of the gods. When Leviathan thrashed, those cables arced with stolen storm and shipboard charge. Kong seized the moment. He took the mast like a lightning rod, and in a moment that braided human craft with primal will, he angled the mast so that a surging arc of coil energy dove into Leviathan's exposed flank. The current did not cut like a knife. It convulsed like a seizure, bubbling the great creature's tissues and disturbing the precise ionic balance that let its muscles function under immense pressure. Leviathan flailed, and its tail carved a canyon through the island that rained rock. But the wound had opened a new possibility. Under the convulsion of electrical trauma, the membrane over one great eye split, and Kong, with a cry that sounded more like grief than triumph, drove both fists into the cavity. He felt tendons and cartilage give beneath his hands. He felt the ancient thing's will falter like a star sputtering in the final turn. Leviathan retaliated with a colossal swallow that sought to pull Kong into the deeper dark, but the cables tethered to capstans held, men and women at the winches grunting with every pull, and the mast became a lift. Kong clenched, heaved, and used every last scrap of learned cunning to wrench Leviathan's head out of the water. The island became an amphitheater of violence. Rocks that once had been sanctuary were flung like teeth. Geysers of steam rose as vents met cold, and were forced into eruption by the beast's internal chaos. Momentum shifted in ways that felt irreverent to the old philosopher's scales. Will could blunt inevitability if it could find a hint. Leviathan, great as it was, had evolved to be a master of the unstirred sea. It had not learned to pass intent and improvisation the way Kong had. In its confusion, it splashed more water inland. But the reprieve was short. Kong moved with the deliberate cruelty of a guardian forced to become executioner. He dislocated joints, severed nerve bundles with cliffs like knives, and with each wound the Leviathan's song changed from dominion to panic. In the end, the fatal beat was not a single definitive strike, but the accumulation of choices. The island's people holding their lines, Kong turning salvage into weaponry, vents and shoals reshaping tidal advantage into environmental traps, and the apex guardian applying care as a form of violence, protecting his world by dismantling an invader's capacity to remain a law. When Leviathan finally went down, bested not merely by force but by the network of agency that had converged upon it, the sea did not swallow its name so much as cough it up onto the shore as a broken thing. It lay across two worlds, great eyes glazing as the tide slowly receded, and Kong sat upon the highest rock and roared, until his voice blurred into the wind. He was wounded beyond imagining. One arm hung crooked, ribs like splintered staves, yet he had not simply won. He had answered the philosophical test that had been asked of them both, that guardianship, shaped by relationship and cunning, could rival the cold architecture of primordial right. People came forward in the days that followed, to mark the place with offerings, not of domination but of gratitude. The philosophers who had argued in the amphitheater stitched new notes into their tones, admitting that scale could be overcome if the smaller could invent the means to make the larger's laws malfunction. Leviathan's bones became a geography of caution. Children dared to balance on its ribs, for stories about the time the island's will bent the ocean. Kong walked among them like a wounded monarch, who understood that victory carried its own cost and its own obligation. He had not proven that compassion beat brutality for all time. He had proven that in this instance, in this place, a choice to defend, to remember and to adapt could tilt the cosmos. The world that remained after the fight was scarred and altered, but that endurance, the elders whispered, was the true verdict. Not that power had been cleansed of its dangers, but that power combined with care could be a counterweight to the indifferent laws the deep carried. Kong closed his eyes and listened to the sea, which now spoke in lower, humbler tones, as if learning the name of a new neighbor. The island rebuilt, and in its rebuilding the story hardened into a principle. When a guardian refuses to yield, the old orders must answer, and sometimes they answer by changing.